I want to read to you some of the questions we used that we sent to them in preparation for the panel today, and that they'll be responding to, although of course they'll also be addressing other issues. So those questions are, how has anthropology of education changed from the 1970s to today? How did it change within your institutions? How did the field evolve in relation to policy and professional audiences? How did anthropology of education change in relation to larger changes within the discipline of anthropology? And what are the major debates within the field that have emerged over this period of time? Professor Chuck Harrington could not be with us this morning. He sends his regrets. But I thought we might start by looking at an editorial he wrote when he took over the editorship of the Anthropology and Education Quarterly in 1977. It was a really important period for our field because the journal moved, or the publication moved from a newsletter to a journal under his leadership, of course, with others working alongside him. And in his first editorial, which is from 1977, Professor Harrington signals 3 hallmarks of the field. The first one is, as we discussed yesterday, that anthropologists have taken very broad views of education, thinking about education well beyond schools, well beyond limited institutions. The second hallmark that he identifies is methodology and the importance of participant observation to our work. In some ways, this echoes what Michael Scroggins told us yesterday about the centrality of long-term engaged experience to our ways of knowing. The third, and I think this is an interesting one for us to think about, is, for Harrington, the cross-cultural framework. And I'm going to read this in greater depth. He says, the third anthropological orientation is our insistence on examining educational phenomena in a cross-cultural framework as part of an anthropological commitment to the study of everyone alive on Earth. Not to be ambitious or anything. As such, we are not content with what so much mainstream psychology, and especially experimental psychology, often seems to be, the psychology of 100 undergraduates at a large Midwestern university, as if that stands in for all of humanity, right? While many educators have become aware of the necessity of broadening their subject base, the mainstream of the discipline is still culture-bound. Even comparative education is largely, at this time, limited to Western European-influenced cultures. When studies of education in our own society do occur in anthropology, the discipline requires that such research, at least implicitly, be put into some cross-cultural or cross-ethnic comparative frame. And I think we might think about the extent to which and the ways in which we do that during this contemporary period. So I wanted to bring his words into conversation with our other speakers today. I'd like to begin, if I may, with Professor Nancy Hornberger from University of Pennsylvania, who has just finished her tenure as Anthropology of Education Quarterly editor. And so, yeah, indeed, kudos to you. We certainly appreciate your service in that role. We have one of the current editors of Anthropology of Education Quarterly with us today as well, Laura Valdivieso, who is a TC grad. So you will hear her later today. But Nancy, we are very pleased to have you here, and we very much look forward to the insights you'll share with us.
Well, first of all, thank you, Lesley and Hervé, for inviting me to be here. Actually, the invitation kind of forced me to take a look back on the 5 years that I've been editing AEQ. We're just in the transition. As of January, Lauda and Sally Gallman take the helm. So it's a good moment for me to look back, to be forced to look back. I tend to just plow ahead sometimes without being reflective enough, so I really appreciate that. And I also am so pleased that you mentioned Chuck Harrington's editorial, which I confess I had never read, but his 3 points are sort of like the first 3 things I was going to say. And one of the things I wanted to, in my reflections about AEQ, is that I feel that my tenure and what we've been, trying to, with my team, which is very much a part of my tenure, we've tried very much to maintain the ongoing concerns of anthropology and education that sometimes, resurface in new guises, and that, so there's this combination of maintaining ongoing themes, being alert to the new ways that these themes emerge in the lives of human beings and in learning and teaching, and also a certain reaffirmation of the enduring insights that anthropologists of education have brought to these issues. So that's been a big part of, I think, how I look at my task as editor. I do think that there's also been, relevant to his third point, there's a continuing expansion of the scope of the journal in terms of international contexts and also including scholarship from scholars beyond the shores of the continental United States. And I was very alert to that, and I believe that it will continue to happen under the new editors as well. So those were sort of some initial thoughts about what we've tried to do. But some of the issues that have come up, I'm going to try to reflect in terms of 5 different sort of main things I want to say that I hope will be helpful to this discussion. The core mission of the journal, and we did take a moment during my 5-year tenure to slightly edit the mission statement for the journal, which I didn't bring with me, but the core mission of the journal remains the same, which is to publish ethnographic studies on learning and teaching, both in and out of schools. I mean, I think that's in a nutshell what we're about. And we've tried in education, in our editorial meetings, hi Fred, so nice to see you here. In our editorial meetings and the decisions that we make about which, what manuscripts to accept and so forth, and how to guide the authors. So often we come back to that is our central focus, and the kinds of issues that we have to sort of be alert to are that the work that we're trying to feature in that particular journal, we want it to really be ethnographic, to have multiple sources of data, that we get a lot of submissions that are based on interview studies, and we have to, sort of regretfully tell the authors this isn't really the place for that, because what we really want to feature is research that goes deeper than talking to people. Certainly talking to people is a good thing to do, but we also want to have participant observation, long-term participant observation, not just short visits to classrooms and so forth. So that's something that we talk a lot about, the methodological approaches of the submissions that we get. And then the other thing that we constantly seem to come back to as a touch point for is this or is this not something to go into the AEQ is the issue of situating the study in the literature on anthropology and education, which by now is quite substantial. Yesterday you were hearing some about the history of this field, how it's emerged, and there's a lot of stuff to read and refer to, and while at the same time trying not to be too insular in our, inspection, I guess you could say, of the ways that people are situating their work. We do also want to try to build up this way of looking at things that has developed within anthropology and education. But in terms of the issues that I think we've, continued to bring out under my tenure, we continue to be very interested in uncovering the hidden and taken for granted ways that language, culture, and identity intersect with learning and with belonging in communities. And sort of hand in hand with that, uncover the hidden and taken for granted ways that social inequality is constructed and resisted and even sometimes maybe overturned in schools and learning communities and communities. So that's on, my first sort of set of comments was about that, was about what is the sort of core focus of the kinds of articles that we're looking for, or the kind of themes that we're trying to encourage in the field. One of the things that I've noticed as editor, and that's been just kind of a wonderful, exciting learning curve for me, is the diverse conceptual repertoires that people bring to this work. The immense kind of turning to a very rich evolution in social theory over the last decades as well, that people are bringing in to the anthropological studies of education. And the ways that, some of the things that we were able to feature in the years that I was editing were different kinds of attempts to grapple with, whatever you want to call it. The easiest way that we often fall back on is the micro-macro issue, the structure, agency, relationship. And we did have a feature issue that explored that from a linguistic anthropological point of view. We also had Doug Foley and Lois Weiss and Michelle Fine in a little dialogue about class culture studies of education, and what Lois and Michelle were suggesting, the notion of critical bifocality that they brought forward in that dialogue. We had a theme issue on voice that I think also was trying to uncover both the ways that in learning contexts, the ways that learners can speak, but also be heard, so that voice is not just about being able to speak, it's also about being able to be heard. And that implies the whole larger context of what is in the way of being heard. So a diverse conceptual repertoire, some ways that people are trying to grapple with how do we address the large issues of inequality in our social structures through ethnographic research. A third area I wanted to highlight is the also rich repertoire, I guess you could say again, of methodological approaches and also methodological issues that come up. I think there's a lot of concerns coming from different directions around the researcher-participant relationship. Some of it has to do with the greater call for, that goes back a couple of decades, or several decades now, the greater call for more reflexivity and awareness of the researcher's own positionality in the research. That's one area that I was commenting to some of my colleagues. It's interesting to me that many of the reviewers' comments that come back will explicitly say, I'd like to see more of the researcher's own positionality in this. They've sort of glossed over it. Let's hear a little bit more about it. And authors are usually very happy to do that, but it's been a consistent kind of theme that comes up in the comments we're getting back. But there's another way that the researcher-participant relationship has been, I think, explored, deepened in recent years is the whole area of collaborative research. more ways of working collaboratively with your participants, whether it's practitioner inquiry or other types of team ethnographic approaches. And then a third area that's sort of problematizing that researcher-participant relationship is the whole wider context of the IRB requirements of the researchers' institutions, coupled with the very constraining and oppressive context of public schools that make it much, much harder for teachers, for teachers to feel free, I guess, to have researchers in their classrooms, for school districts to give permission for researchers to be in classrooms, and so making it a lot harder, I think, for researchers to be in classrooms. And that's, I think, having an effect on our field. Certainly there are lots of interesting places for anthropologists of education to look at teaching and learning that's not in public school classrooms, but that's always been a really important central part of our enterprise. And so that's a challenge for the field, I think. There's also been, in terms of methodological issues, as I said, that we get a lot of submissions of just interview studies, which are pretty clearly not, something that we can pursue. But what's a little harder to decide are the studies that are definitely anthropologically grounded and very much about bringing out the emic perspective of the participants, but are based primarily on narrative and discourse analysis rather than the kinds of long-term participant observation that is more traditionally ethnographic. So that's something we've dealt with as an editorial team, how far to go with that. It does seem like there's a lot of richness there that we don't want to just shut out of the Anthropology and Education Quarterly. The whole area of digital and online and media spaces and how to study those ethnographically is also something that I think is becoming more of a trend in AEQ and in our field in general. And then the area of team ethnography, how to work as ethnographic teams. We have had a couple of pieces in the last 5 years that I think have have explored that a little bit. There was a piece by Blackledge and Crease on their team ethnography in the UK, and then there's Terry McCarty and Jim Collins and Rodney Hobson did a piece that was not team. That's another sort of. I'm sorry, I'm mushing two things together here. Team ethnography is one thing. Another thing is comparative ethnographic work. So trying to look across different cases comparatively in the tradition that Himes, outlined for us many years ago. The concrete, comparative, cumulative, critical ethnographic work that's needed. A fourth area that I wanted to just touch on is the concern that the work we do is relevant for educational practice, be relevant for educational practice. And of course, a lot of this has been mentioned several times, not only by Lesley, but several times by me as well, that a lot of our work is informal schooling context, classrooms, and particularly increasingly multilingual and multicultural classrooms, but also many other contexts of learning that have emerged in the pages of AEQ in the last 5 years, including religious education, indigenous communities, the kinds of education that go on in indigenous communities, a deaf church. There's been a special issue on economic activities, informal and formal economic activities, and the informal and formal learning that goes on in those. And another special issue on community change initiative and how, related to education, but also broader social change. So I think that there's all of those contexts for looking at learning and teaching, but there's still always this sort of underlying concern to keep the work relevant to educational practice. in one way or in another. And then finally, the fifth thing I wanted to touch on was the concern around speaking directly to educational policy. Again, these are all things that I think have been part of AEQ and of the anthropology of education from the start. I'm just sort of trying to, I guess, talk about how they're ongoing, but how they emerge in new kinds of guises in the recent years. We had one article that was very popular by Jennifer Adair, where she was talking about writing of a policy brief based on ethnographic research. So one way to try to speak directly to policymakers to distill ethnographic research into a policy brief. And another that I'll end with, because it's something that I've been also exploring or writing about a little bit more in my work, going back to Heim's idea of ethnographic monitoring as a way of tracking the ways that policy plays out in specific contexts and well, be able to see what the uncover the hidden, see what's really happening, and then speak back to the policy itself or the policymakers. I think that's all I wanted to say for now. I'm hoping that in the discussion, I do also have all those years at GSE. I know Fred talked some about Penn GSE yesterday, and Kathy's comments may also, there's a lot of Penn GSE here. People already have commented on that. So I'm sure that will come out in the discussion. I'd be happy to contribute more on that. And also on the forum, specifically the ethnography forum at Penn GSE. So I'm going to save that for what comes out in the discussion. Thanks.
I want to introduce now Professor Peter Demarath from University of Minnesota, who has his own Penn connections, but has managed to break off and move into other spheres. For a long time at Ohio State, and most recently at University of Minnesota. We're very glad to have you with us.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. And when I saw the title of this conference, I was very pleased to be invited to be a part of it. I think it's extremely timely. And I also really appreciate the historical situatedness of our work here from the sessions yesterday. In August, I was actually back in Pere Village in Manus Province, Papua New Guinea, in part to continue to work with the local community council on the rebuilding of the Margaret Mead Community Center there. That's where my wife and I both did our doctoral research back in 1995, and we've been working with the local community council on sustainable development for many years now, in part with a gift from Margaret Mead's good friend, Barbara Roll. And so we were back there, and the community council told us they are planning to have a specific room in this community center that will be a Margaret Mead museum. And they want to have her books there. They want to have old recordings of talk place, of indigenous language. They want to have old recordings of Garamut, slick gong drumming as well. If you want to see any photos of this, they're on my website at the U of M on my people page. And then we returned to Minnesota at the end of August and went back to our house, which is actually the house that B.F. Skinner used to live in when he was at the university between 1941 and 1944.
You showed him.
So, yeah. Right, yeah. So feel free, if you're ever in St. Paul, to drop by, and you can come by and we can maybe sacrifice some chickens or burn some incense, because we're still in the process of trying to exercise some of the spirits of behaviorism from the house. So you understand, right? I guess here's where I'll start. I want to talk a bit about public anthropology today and applied anthropology. So when I'm asked what I do, I often simply say anthropology of education, but sometimes if the conversation starts with anthropology, I'll say I do applied anthropology, drawing on the subfields of cultural anthropology, linguistic anthropology, even physical anthropology. We'll get there. But the identification of anthropology of education as kind of applied anthropology has become more clear to me over the last several years, largely because of two developments in the field. The emergence of applied anthropology as the fifth subfield of the discipline, and the increasing visibility and vigor of public anthropology. And this is where I'm going to start. And then I want to move into the efforts of anthropologists of education to make their work more public, more relevant, and more impactful. And then I'll describe some of my own efforts to, in a way, put anthropology to work both in my writing and on the surface of professional educational initiatives at the University of Minnesota over the last 6 years. And I've got a handout that I'll give to you in just a little bit. I'll also talk about some of the dilemmas and challenges I've run up against there. So let's talk about public anthropology first. And I've discerned several patterns, and I'm sure many of you have, among those who either write about this or do this. Shirley Bryce Heath has said that this involves taking lessons from applied anthropology, especially working out of, in her words, a felt need. Terry McCarty has referred to this challenge as, quote, actuating a scholarship of democracy. I'm not sure how many of you have done this, but I went ahead and downloaded Rob Borofsky's book from 2011, Why a Public Anthropology, and I've used a chapter in that in my Anthropology and Education class. And as you may know, much of the book gives cultural anthropology a very hard time for its lack of attention to cumulative theory building. And so there's an interesting critique there. But there are also some clear articulations of what a public anthropology can contribute. And I think most importantly is, in Borofsky's words, quote, facilitating transparency and accountability in major institutions, using a power of comparison to illuminate key dynamics behind critical social concerns. And so he says that anthropologists can help facilitate this greater transparency in public institutions so policymakers can look behind their claims of this or that to assess what's actually going on. All right, and this goes right back to the Himes work that we just heard about, of course. And of course, one of the major manifestations of this commitment to public anthropology in our field is the anthropology of education policy. And so we have excellent exemplars and people who have written these exemplars. Jill Koyama is here, Thea El-Hajj is here, others, Terry McCartney, Ted Hammond, Brad Levinson. These are all excellent models. I still think Jill has one of the best titles for any book to come out of anthropology of education. It was what? Really? Excellent. Making failure pay. So one of the great central challenges in this this turn towards public anthropology of education is, I think, translation. Translation of contingent, contextualized, complex understandings into clear and concise recommendations for policy and practice. So we all know quality ethnography when we see it, and it was especially helpful to hear Nancy talk about what AEQ has looked for and continues to look for in that. The nuance, the contextualization, the inclusion of negative cases, the humility signaled by including dimensions of authorial subjectivity that comes with a serious consideration of the postmodern critique of anthropology, of course. But part of our problem is the way that we see our subject is unfamiliar to many practitioners and policymakers in schools. And so you may recall yesterday Hervé ended his remarks in the morning session by talking about our enterprise and talking about how at some point we go ahead and analyze our data and then we need to translate it back. So I want to talk more about that translating back part because I think that's something that we have not paid enough attention to as applied anthropologists. So in terms of the work that we do, we all know that we tend to use a very broad canvas. We try to take into account myriad contextual factors across time and space and to consider how they've shaped everyday beliefs and practices, right? But as anthropologists, part of our work also is to question many of the very terms that practitioners and educators and policymakers use. So in the words of Jean Komaroff, quote, in the best anthropological tradition, we don't take categories at face value. We don't take schools at face value. So back in one of their first policy pieces, Shore and Wright said, quote, the task for an anthropology of the present is to unsettle and to dislodge the certainties and orthodoxies that govern the present. And then in a similar spirit, in 2008, Hervé wrote, education itself must be our core concern, particularly if we want to help, but this concern must take us as far away from America as possible. And that also gets, of course, to Chuck Harrington's insight from that 1977 AEQ editorial, the value of the cross-cultural perspective. So part of our problem then is that the very nature of our analytical work, our problematizing, our troubling perhaps, takes us away from the categories in use of those whom we might seek to influence. And so furthermore, and I believe, Kathy, was it Philip Salzman who, one of the readings I'm drawing on here was from a conference that Kathy organized with Brad Levinson and Amy Stambach on public anthropology. And so the quote was, "The professional benefit of the doubt that we extend each other in our field, coming from our embodied presence in the field, is not similarly extended to us by the general public." And he commented that this is a doubtful way for a field to proceed. So the problem then, one of the challenges is we don't endeavor enough to translate our findings back to potential public audiences in ways that they can readily understand and use. So this is one thing I want to talk about a bit here, and I want to draw on two anthropologists that I think are leading the way here, Catherine Lutz and Norma Gonzalez. So Catherine Lutz has observed that anthropologists often speak in, quote, almost autistic private languages. She advises those of us that would do public anthropology to avoid these, quote, tortured discussions and instead speak as we would speak in public. So she says to follow the heart of the matter rather than hooking into an au courant issue. She says that we ought to write with more clarity. We ought to especially lay out our arguments in terms of the conventional wisdom that they are responding to, all right? And this has been a turn for me, especially in the writing of my book. Our data aren't necessarily fascinating on their own to potential audiences. What we need to, right? Do you get this? So what we need to do is we need to explain the intervention that our data can make, that our interpretations can make in prevailing understandings. That's pretty important. Catherine Lutz says we need to write more from the heart, from first impulses. And I think one of the most important insights I've taken from her work is that she says that as academics, we're extremely self-censoring. We are self-censoring. The effect of this is that we funnel ourselves into very narrow discourses so we'll adequately impress our reference groups. That's her quote. And so she says that we need to monitor this as writers. We need to monitor when this self-censoring kicks in. When does it kick in? And also, extremely importantly, she says to treat our writing more like teaching. All right? She says, quote, if you are not writing to teach, you need to change something. So she also says we need to let go of our footnote fetish. That's her term. So now on to Norma Gonzalez. So she's been more specific on some of these matters, especially regarding our categories in use, which I think is kind of the analytical heart of the matter. And this speaks to Hervé's point about how we might disagree with practitioners and policymakers about our units of analysis, but not our units of concern. So at the AAAs in 2005, Norma Gonzalez observed that, quote, we can't influence educational communities if we produce knowledge only for colleagues. So more specifically, she argued that as anthropologists, we expose the inadequacies of reductive explanations of educational processes, but we need to better explain why complexity matters. But one of our challenges is getting over or coming to terms with our deep-seated fears of reductionism and our reluctance to essentialize. The problem, of course, is that we may be very careful of generalization, but generalization is at the heart of policy formation. Policymakers need to hear unitary messages. So for us, this means coming to terms with methodological and epistemological prices that we may need to pay. And so Norma Gonzalez encourages us to try to be more heteroglossic in appropriating discourse, to think about generalizable principles, to try to push our disciplinary boundaries, to take a more practice-based approach to policy. And most importantly, she encourages us to try to make schools and communities rather than the academy as the crucible for our work, and that's her term, our crucible. So I've tried to adopt some of these approaches in my own writing in the book I wrote on producing success in a suburban Ohio public school, and I found that in this kind of writing, you need to locate your own personal, human, situated voice as a member of the public, really, and so in a way that reveals why you care about the issue. So in a way, rejoining the public as a person with concerns, perhaps in addition to an academic with problems. And by the way, I loved Jennifer Van Tiem's description of the appeal of anthropology from yesterday, how you can take these things out of the moment, and then they can live on in other places. I really like that. But I think in order to do this, in this kind of writing, you have to lead with the voices and participants, lead with the voices and experiences of your participants. So you'll engage a broader readership, and you have to learn to get out of the way of their voices and experiences. And so of that work, one of the things I was really happy to hear was when an assistant principal in that very school said of the project, it has helped them to see themselves. And I really appreciated that. So I want to also talk a little bit about, I've got a handout here. I want to talk a little bit about, there are a couple copies over there. My experience in trying to sort of put anthropology to work at the University of Minnesota. And so I came to the University of Minnesota about 6 years ago. So I came to University of Minnesota about 6 years ago after spending 10 years on the faculty at Ohio State. And so a few historical developments that have shaped my work there, and I'm talking more about programmatic work, but also work in schools. First of all, there was a Foundations of Education department there at the U of M a long time ago, but it was dissolved in 1993. It was actually called the Department of Social and Philosophic Studies in Education. And then those faculty gradually retired over the last 15 years, and they were not replaced. The last anthropologist of education in the department was Marian Daubert, who retired in 2000. You might know her work on primate biology and behavior and what can be learned from education and learning there. And I still use one of her pieces on primate biology and behavior in my Anthro and Ed class. And then the College of Education and Human Development at the U of M, that's my college, finished a very expensive refitting of its most geographically desirable building in 2007, and it's perched right above the Mississippi River. It's an old warehouse. Now it's this beautiful building, and the name of the building is the Education Sciences Building. You get one guess as to what department is located in that building. And then finally, our university has had a whole series of large budgetary cutbacks from the state legislature over the last 6 years. Huge decrease in operating expenses, budgets annually. So the university is getting smaller. Many of us are being asked to or feel compelled to do more with less. We actually had a governor that suggested that the entire university could be put on an iPod, but that hasn't happened yet. So in thinking about work at universities, and working in universities and going to a new university, I was reminded of what my old chair at Ohio State once told me, Bob Donmoyer. He told me that in working at a university, you can kind of take two paths. One path is to be a monk. The other path is to be an entrepreneur. Giving you a hard time about that. The entrepreneurial thing, we've heard a lot about this, right? Tom Friedman wrote about this in his newest book on the ever-flattening world, and he talked about how we all ought to think about like Perkins waitresses. Have you heard this? We need to think of like Perkins waitresses in terms of giving customers a little bit extra, maybe a little bit extra fruit. That's something we can control, and then they'll give us a bigger tip, okay? Thinking entrepreneurially. I'm very ambivalent about this. But one of the things that I've learned about anthropology is that, and I really appreciated the way Fred talked about this yesterday, that one way to think about anthropology in a large college of education is how it might get lost. Part of that is, Fred and I talked about this yesterday, is giving up credit, right, for how it has gotten lost and who has helped to get it lost. The importance is in what it accomplishes and where it's put to work, right? So Dorothy Holland has referred to this as the need to enter into institutional relationships, drawing on actor network theory, series of linkages among actors. To think of our discipline as a field and drawing on Latour's notion, thinking of actor network as snaking from our field into other arenas, right? So if you just quickly look at this handout, I'll just take a couple more minutes here quickly to talk about this. On the first page, and by the way, I would change the title here to Anthropology and Public Education. This was a phrase that Fred used yesterday, and it's certainly more apt than educational projects. Lesley and I talked about this yesterday, and this does not quite have the ideological or political valences of educational projects in the way that she has articulated them. But one of the things that for me that I want to also mention here is the role of anthropology and education in the preparation of educational professionals. Gloria Ladson-Billings has talked about this for several years now at an AERA session in 2012. She lamented that most teacher education programs in the United States do not have an educational anthropology course, and that many teacher education candidates leave their programs with insufficient understanding of culture and cultural process and how culture works, especially their own. Same in leadership programs. So I've actually taken this a little too far in my career. I've taught a required Foundations of Education class for teacher candidates for the last 16 years. And up until recently, I've taught this as a very thinly disguised Anthropology of Education course. And I thought this is what they really needed, right? A heavy dose of Anthropology of Education. But this was until one of my new colleagues at Minnesota kind of saw what I was up to and sat me down and said, you really can't do this, you know. There are other disciplinary perspectives that have to be included in this kind of course. And so I began to take philosophy of education, history of education, sociology of education much more seriously, and to incorporate this into this new course. And that's what you see here, the EDHD 5000 sequence. This is a year-long course. It was in part supported by a large grant that our college received from the Bush Foundation, not that Bush. All right? And I've put this together with a colleague named Michael Goh, who's a multicultural educator and educational psychologist. And so this course kind of spans foundations of education, multicultural education, and also other areas that we knew from our exit survey data that our teacher candidates needed more preparation in, such as partnering with parents and communities, being smart about how to navigate school culture, organizational culture, these kinds of things as well. And so here's, the title of the course was actually suggested by our coordinator of the teacher education program. It's called Great Lessons in Culture, Schools, and Communities. Being in Minnesota, I would kind of prefer pretty good lessons, but this is where it's set up. And so I've been in the interesting situation of having to advocate for the ongoing inclusion of philosophy here. Some people want to take it out, and they don't see the relevance of it. And so I've really learned quite a bit about what philosophy can do for us. I mean, it's an arena where, purposes of school, almost all dimensions of schooling can be deliberated and brought into discussion. And certainly with ontology, there are opportunities to hijack that a bit for a discussion of cultural relativism, especially the way Mead would talk about it. So that's been very helpful. And then we actually have Great Lesson 9, you see working in schools. We actually do that in a high school. And the assignment there for that great lesson, which is professional rotations, kind of like becoming an amateur anthropologist, doing a bit of observation in schools, that was developed with the principal of this high school, which was a very interesting experience. The next one, Minnesota Principals Academy, I just did this presentation on Wednesday of this week. And this is my first time doing this. This is still, I think, somewhat crude. But I'm still working through this. But it was very interesting, 32 principals from all over the state coming together for this enrichment academy. It's 2 days a month for 2 years. And so I was one of the lead-off speakers on this. If you turn over under, let's see, subsection 3, the role of in-school politics and power and change efforts. This is from sociology of education, mainly Seymour Saracen. And there are many lessons there to be learned for us as anthropologists being involved in schools. And then a couple last things. The AAA paper proposal that I've got here, this was co-written with the Director of Evaluation of St. Paul Public Schools. And that's one of the interesting things that I've been involved in, is actually co-writing a AAA proposal with a practitioner, an administrator in St. Paul Public. So we'll see how this goes. The main thing I want to say, though, is that I could not have done that Principals Academy presentation if I hadn't spent time as an evaluator on this large St. Paul school leadership grant, this turnaround leadership grant. I've been working on case studies of 2 secondary schools, a middle school and a high school, spending time following principals, shadowing them, interviewing them, attending meetings with them, learning about their work, and really having that embodied presence that we talked about yesterday, that Michael Scroggins talked about, as far as an essential feature, perhaps the essential feature of our work. And so that, for me, has given me a sense of authority, perhaps still tenuous, but able to be involved then in principal leadership development. At one point last year, I was sitting in the office of a teacher on special assignment and administrator at a high school, and she said, you know, Peter, you're really good at just sitting in a room and not saying anything. So I think that's a compliment, right? Okay, and then the last thing is this. This is a minor, a graduate minor that we have in our department. This goes back to the reason I'm bringing this up. This goes back. This is the last thing I want to talk about, just very briefly. Back to your provost comments yesterday, Thomas James, that we really ought to see ourselves in foundational fields as being part of one transdisciplinary community. So simply put, as an anthropologist of education, I want philosophy of education, I want history of education, I want comparative studies of education, gender studies, ethnic studies of education. I want all of those subfields, those perspectives, to be vital too, all right? And so this minor allows students to take courses from a whole variety of departments across our university and get credit for this graduate minor in what we're now referring to as sociocultural studies in education. So I think this is in part what Ed Gordon is referring to when he talked yesterday about his vision for a transdisciplinary study of humankind. And so I think we also need to be more a part of school communities themselves, drawing on our embodied presence to build teaching and learning relationships there. And so letting, as Norma Gonzalez has said, schools to be crucibles for our work as well. Thanks.
Our third speaker this morning then is Professor Kathy Hall. We're delighted to have you here, also at University of Penn, and Kathy's going to be talking more about, of course, her experiences in the field and some visioning for the future. Welcome, Professor Hall.
I want to be provocative just to open up a conversation. So I don't think that these are things I really believe. I think that I'm raising some of these issues and opening things up just in order to hopefully enrich our conversation and in the spirit of what I've learned from their interventions over the year about the value of ed schools, et cetera. So in order to, can you hear me still? Yeah, there's a computer here too. In order to speak to the conference theme on the future of anthropology in schools of education, I want to think with you about some aspects of what I see as the curious nature of the anthropological study of education, and with education defined broadly as learning, cultural production and transmission, socialization in and out of schools, etc. I think it might be instructive, in part, to think about how our subfield is similar to and can be differentiated from, structurally, from related subfields in anthropology, such as legal anthropology. I'm also trained as a legal anthropologist and medical anthropology. And in this sense, in each of these subfields that are tied to professional practice and professionals, are there single fields in these subfields? Have there ever been? Is there a single field of anthropology of education? Has there ever been? For of course there are anthropologists who are trained in disciplinary departments, as well as those who identify as anthropologists and are trained in anthropology in ed schools, very well trained, who are in ed schools, who choose to be in ed schools. I'm one of those. My background is in anthropology from Chicago, and I chose to be in a school of education, and a very fine one, and I was fortunate that Fred hired, however, why he ever did, but that he hired me. And Nancy was dean, so. And anthropologists, there are anthropologists, of course, increasingly, who study related topics, now under very popular headings of childhood studies, youth studies, who are in anthropology departments. And I remember when I was on the job market, I would change, how I talked about work that I was doing in schools to translate, as Peter's saying, the category so it would be understandable in these different audiences. There are also anthropologists in ed schools who have closer ties with anthropology and with anthropologists on campuses, and those that have closer ties to, say, teacher education or other subfields in education, and weaker ties with the discipline. So there's a whole range of ways that, you know, the work that we do is, and the relations we have are configured, and always have been, I think. But there has been a tendency for educational researchers, but has there been a tendency for educational researchers in ed schools, as well as medical anthropologists increasingly in med schools, to become professionalized as educational researchers in ways that make our research less anthropological? Here's where I'm being provocative. Or at least less closely tied to developments in the discipline, which that could be seen as a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you see the discipline at the moment. And I agree with a lot of what Peter said about non-intelligibility, et cetera, speaking to ourselves. Does this allow them to conduct anthropological research that colleagues in ed schools and possibly practitioners and policymakers would then recognize as more relevant and useful, having greater impact? Or should we as anthropologists be struggling against this professionalization, if indeed it has occurred, particularly as universities become increasingly corporatized and educational research succumbs once again to the lure of scientism to gain greater legitimacy with government policymakers, et cetera? And I think Hervé's written a great deal about this too, and Fred as well, in terms of No Child Left Behind and method. How are we best to maintain what I personally view, and Peter talked a bit about this quite eloquently, I think, as one of anthropology's central strengths and contributions, and Nancy too, in relation to Dale Heim's work, its critical stance and effort to gain insight into the underlying taken for granted and lived assumptions, call it ideology, hegemony, discursive regimes, whatever flavor of theory you prefer, that provides a foundation or legitimation for power relations in society. And here I want to be provocative again, and mainly because I don't have any answers, and I look forward to a great conversation. Rather than expend our energies trying to become more relevant to the fields of education in ed schools, should we be trying to become more relevant to anthropology as a space from which to gain more politically productive theoretical vantage points, and a space from which we can revisit education and schooling in more critical ways that examine what is happening in schools and classrooms in broader contexts of globalization, neoliberalization, and the rise of technoscience, et cetera? And some of us do that. I've been writing a piece on the anthropology of neoliberalism, and it's been really surprising to me. There's some great examples here in the room, Jill's work, and Peter's written, Lesley, and others, but how little work there's been on neoliberalism in education when it's so central to what's happening to our schools. Why is that? Have we become complicit or narrow in our view of the problem so that we're missing the broader forces that are that we really, I would argue, might need to take on to really affect the kind of changes that we want to make? Why hasn't it been more central? I guess I wanted to raise these questions about intellectual spaces and critical stances on our object of study, education, because I came into the field, into my position, thanks to Fred in an ed school, at a very specific moment in our history, the cultural turn, as it was called, or actually the cultural studies, Marxist theory-informed turn. I had long been interested in education. I thought about majoring in education in college, but had decided to pursue anthropology. But while at University of Chicago, Willis's Learning to Labor in the 80s, became a force. And it ignited my passion to study the racialization of social mobility in schools and other sites in the lives of the Sikh kids who were growing up in England, who allowed me to spend some time with them. Paul Willis brought Jean Lave to Berkeley's Ed School from an anthropology department at Irvine to create the Social and Cultural Studies program. And it was a very exciting moment where, I thought that Fred and others had won the battle, the quantitative, qualitative battle, and that, we were looking up and there was this really fruitful set of exchanges. There was this transdisciplinary community between sociology of ed and anthro ed and ed school groups around this cultural studies moment. But then I think Lesley writes about this in her wonderful statement. Then, scientism emerged again, and I'm still trying to figure out where to go from here, to be honest. And so at that point, along with Bourdieu and later Foucault, it gave others of us, Bradley, Amy, Lesley, Peter, Riddy, Thea, and many others, a powerful political perspective from which to view educational processes and learning in broader contexts, the nation in relation to citizenship, et cetera. I don't see, I might be missing something, but I don't see this kind of focused school of thought set of exchanges and pushing theory forward in our field at the moment. And I wonder if that's something that is missing that is important to reclaim. And I also don't see us drawing as productively from work in the discipline. It often seems to me that ed school-focused anthropologists have created a new field, only loosely in conversation with developments in the discipline. That might be a good thing. I imagine there could be strong arguments for that, but I also wonder if, given the need for this, my sense of the argument I'm making for this critical stance, whether we're losing something in that sense. Also, it continues to be curious to me why it is that the discipline hardly recognizes what we do. Why haven't educational anthropologists made, including myself, I'm guilty, made more powerful theoretical contributions to the discipline, similar to our colleagues in legal and medical anthropology? Is it only because more legal and medical anthropologists are in anthropology departments? Is it due to our commitment to professional policy relevance and the way that this affects the kind of questions we ask, the theories we draw upon, et cetera? Does it matter if our primary commitment is to professionals and policymakers? Is there another way to maintain a critical stance? These are all questions that are in my head, I hope we can discuss. Is there another way to maintain a critical stance as educational anthropologists without sinking into, and I'm being provocative again, what sometimes has a sense of feel-good but possibly politically naive and too often ahistorical social justice approaches? What I continue to struggle with is what is a theory of power and therefore of change that can inform a critical anthropology of education to truly contribute to the politics of education in our neoliberal, increasingly technoscience-oriented era. I greatly, and I just added this because I thought some of the comments dovetail really nicely with Peter's wonderful presentation. I greatly appreciated Peter's call for translating back from our unsettling of categories, but I wonder if that is so easy. I completely agree with the call for clarity. I get on my students all the time, don't I, about, being in an interdisciplinary field and being able to talk and be accessible and be read. And following the heart of the matter. But I wonder if it is easy to translate our categories back while holding on to the critique. Is it possible, if it's possible, how? If we produce reductionistic, essentializing unitary messages, do we become complicit with reproducing particular ways of knowing, with celebrating failure, for example, or the use of that, deployment of that term? And ways of viewing and framing the problems. I look forward to hearing from all of you. When I teach, I teach an anthropology of ed course that Fred started years ago at Penn, and I often teach what I call the Erickson-Ogbu debate, and I reduce it because it's a way for students to learn about debate in our field, and I often end with McDermott and Brent's Successful Failure and the way they completely turned around, the question of minority school failure. Having a great time somewhere else, we miss them here. And thank you again for inviting me in. One of the things that we've done at, this is fun. One of the things we've done at Penn, and some of you in the audience who are in that program can say whether or not it's successful or not, is to deal with marginalization. As we've and I want to read Dottie's stuff on actor network theory, and because we've partnered with allies in anthropology who take seriously working with our students. They are faculty of color as well. They're also involved in Africana studies, and so we've created a community of scholars who are anthropologists in our ed school and in the anthropology department, and our students, doctoral students, do joint degrees, one degree, but in anthropology and education, so that they're well-trained in education and in anthropological theory. And I think while they're not seen as the same kind of anthro student, I think they are seen as anthropology students, And I'm hoping that my secret hope is that that is introducing the study of education into anthropology departments as well, so that there will be more cross-fertilization and not so much marginalization, because I think you're right. I definitely think you're right. And applied research generally in anthropology departments has been looked down on. And I also wonder the feminization of education rather than law and medicine, the power and money behind it, if that all plays a part in, you know, how ed schools on campus generally are positioned, right? We're underneath the spaceship of Wharton that we hope will take off any moment, but it hasn't yet. Yeah.
I'm in education, I'm not an anthropologist, and I have a question about critical perspectives, which are very popular these days, and I'm wondering whether, what your understanding is of critical ethnography, whether you see that particularly in light of the discussion yesterday as a way forward, or a complete redundancy, or something in between.
Redundancy in terms of?
That ethnography and anthropology itself has always been critical.
Oh, I see, yeah.
I can say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll start. So I'll say something about this. And so, you know, many different ways to define critical ethnography, but we all know that in some way, shape, or form, power is involved, or relationships between the whole and parts, to be a little more abstract about it, right? But so, yeah, and this also brings in, I think, Kathy's comments about, and your reference to how we draw on larger theories as explanatory frameworks, right? And so, and you know, I think for me, part of this is what conversations we want to contribute to, what understandings we want to contribute to, what our audiences are, and they may be, of course, multiple audiences. And look, if we're investing a lot of time in ethnographic work, I think we ought to be able to contribute to different kinds of dialogues. I think it's possible to do research with different kinds of purposes, right? But I think I really appreciated Kathy's point about what's the nature of our contributions going to be, and especially the dangers of some of this translating work that we've been talking about today. So, and I'll just give you an example in my own work. So I've been, you know, working as an evaluator in the St. Paul Public Schools, doing case studies of the development of school leadership capacity, but I also very much want to study responsibilization, all right, under conditions of neoliberalism. I'm very concerned about that. That's an ongoing agenda of mine. And this is linked to broader anthropological work on neoliberalism and how neoliberalism is increasingly structuring human social life. And in some ways, you know, when we think about what conversations we can join, sometimes those conversations find us, sometimes we have to go seek them. So I was fortunate that, you know, in some ways I've been drawing on anthropological studies of neoliberalism, Nick Rose's concept of responsibilization from the UK. I think that's very powerful and important, and I've used that in my own work on the development of psychological capital. But in turn, I found that I was contacted to be a part of a conference at University of Cambridge on the social life of achievement out of their anthropology department. So that's an anthropological conversation. Now for me though, I don't mean to be too long-winded here, the key thing has been how does that circle back to the concerns of people in St. Paul Public Schools, all right? And for me, this has been just recently realizing that psychological capital, it's actually quite linked to the emergence of what is referred to as soft skills. You've heard of soft skills? Things like perseverance, things like self-advocacy. And so I'm trying to reframe some of the work that I want to do there in terms that people there can readily understand and latch onto. So not only self-advocacy, but also orientation to competition, and under what conditions. So that's part of, for me, it's a journey, it's a process of kind of iterative circling back and trying to think of ways that the work can be relevant and useful to different kinds of people.
Can I just want to build on that for a second, because I think there are a couple things. We should also remember that through the process of engagement with educators, there are opportunities to insert anthropological concerns, comparative perspectives, and I've seen you do that in your work, in your very long-term engagement with school communities. I'm thinking, there are a couple of points that have been made this morning that I wanted to pick up on, but I'm an anthropologist, so I want to pick up on it by way of a story, more or less. I'm working on this article that's a critique of early grade reading in international educational development. So in a nutshell, the field of international education has taken up DIBELS. If you know anything about reading, DIBELS is a continuous assessment tool that's been heavily critiqued in the US. And it got taken up by a private organization, a private company, with USAID funding, recast as EGRA, and exported around the world as the solution to early grade reading. We can better teach people how to read in schools across the world because we're going to assess them and whether they're doing it or not, and that's going to somehow produce learning. So there are a lot of, brings in neoliberal perspectives about who's making money off this. It brings in all sorts of questions. But to address it, I've tried to do a couple of things. One is I have to draw on anthropology. I have to draw on the anthropology of literacy that questions what is literacy at different moments, in different contexts, in different languages and scripts, and who gets to decide, right? I have to draw on the anthropology of development. So beyond anthro-ed, I need to engage with the broader field of anthropology. But I also have to draw on educational research. I have to look at literacy studies and reading studies in other languages at other places and other times. And so I think one of the points that Peter was making is we have to look, and Kathy's saying, let's look to anthropology, let's be more engaged in anthropology. Yes. Peter's saying, let's also read sociology, philosophy, history of education. Yes. We have to do all of those things simultaneously, which is a lot of work, and it puts us in a bit of a dilemma because our field work already takes a long period of time and we're reading so much, so staying current, addressing policy issues when they emerge rather than 5 years later, right, is a real challenge for us, the temporal aspect. But I think we might take Peter's translation phrase and think of it, I'm trying to channel Greta Gibson here, who's talked about accommodation without assimilation, to think about translation without capitulation. Something about speaking back to the work without accepting their categories.
I've been sitting here thinking about translation, linguist that I am, as whether or not it's an apt metaphor for what we want to do in communicating back to a public on anthropological work. So anyway, your question feeds nicely into what's spinning around in my head. And your question was, what is the role of the anthropologist in working with the communities, with indigenous communities where language and culture are in constant transformation? Was that your question? Yeah. I think it actually does relate. I'm teaching a course right now at Penn, the first time I've taught a new course in a long time, and I'm really enjoying it. It's on indigenous education and language revitalization. And so we started the course with a very rich 2 weeks of discussion based on the work of the two Maori scholars, Linda Tuiwai-Smith and then Mary Berryman, who is less well known but has developed work with her students that she calls culturally responsive methodologies. And out of New Zealand in general, you may be familiar with work by Maori scholars and by scholars who work with Maori. It's a very rich field for thinking about how to work with indigenous communities on language and culture issues. And so I guess the point I'm getting to, I guess the short answer to your question from my point of view, and it's the answer I guess I've always had. So in some ways my thinking is not very, sometimes I think I'm rather simple-minded. I keep saying the same thing over and over again. But I think that the role of the anthropologist has to be as co-participant, listener, somebody who reflects back to the participants that they're working with okay, I'll speak as myself. So a listener who reflects back what I'm hearing, tries to understand what they're saying. I think that also an anthropologist can bring to that conversation experiences elsewhere or over a long, over time. That stories I think are a very rich way of kind of participating. The communities that I've worked with, I always find that there's a lot of uptake of, on the one hand, stories about what is going on in other places and other times, and on the other hand, any kinds of tools of terminologies, actually, and concepts that they can sort of grab onto and say, oh, that's how we talk about what's going on here. So it's a language for talking about the experiences that are going on. Is that sort of an answer? But related to translation, the trouble with translation is that so much is lost in the translation, right? So it's, I mean, I do like your phrase of translation without capitulation, but in one sense, there can never be translation without some capitulation.
But one way to think about that is, yeah, I appreciate the frank conversation of threat, right? But it makes me think about the way Jim Peacock has articulated one of the core contributions of anthropology. He says one of the core contributions is to broaden the framework of discussion. And in my experience working in 2 large colleges of education, of course it depends on how you go about that. But there is ample opportunity for that. A lot of it depends on how you go about it, though. In a teaching mode, as Catherine Lutz would say, rather than, a kind of more arrogant mode. I know something that you don't know. So there is a teaching kind of commitment there that I think is really central to doing that well.
Can I just jump in real quick? What worries me about these kind of I think you're exactly right, and that might be all we can do, but there are 2 issues here that I think I want to put on the table. One is, what is our theory of the problem, and what is our theory of change? And does broadening the conversation lead to change, or does it make us feel like we're contributing something and allow us to get along with our colleagues, which is really important, and maybe be taken more seriously, but to what ends? And second is, if there isn't conflict, is it real? I mean, our colleague Howard Stevenson always says that, and I think it's very, very true. And do we need another model of how to engage through conflict in a way that's constructive? I'm horrible at conflict, so I don't know, but I do intuitively feel that only conversation might not lead to much change, particularly where there are stakes and people are benefiting from certain kinds of ways that they're doing research, and the university is corporatizing, and we're all benefiting from that, a lot of us as individuals, and very deep, complicated stuff that, at least at Penn, how we're supporting our PhD students through the kinds of programs we're creating and branding, marketing our brand, right?
To be honest, I have all kinds of privileges, and I have had. On the other hand, I felt as an outsider in the field of anthropology and education for many, many years, until I became an officer, until I became a treasurer, and until I wrote a book. And I'm being honest, I mean, we really do communicate through books, so don't let departments tell you they want journal articles from you, and that's all right? I was talking to Alex about this. Is Alex here yet? Yeah, all right. Okay, write the book, in part for yourself, because it's gratifying, and that's the way we communicate with each other, okay? So, yeah, and I think that part of this is also finding your communities, your communities that can support you, that you can confide in, and everyone here has multiple selves that all need different kinds of support, and all need to be different in part of different kinds of networks, to go back to Jill's comment too. And Council on Anthropology and Education has all kinds of different communities and committees that you can be a part of, that you can find other people that can nourish and support your multiple selves. But I think that's part of it, is keeping in mind that as an anthropologist of education, you have multiple selves and you have multiple contributions to make. And I think that's one thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I think we do need to talk about, I would like to hear more about what politics of the many I can think of that you were referring to. But I think that there's always going to be politics, and I think it's getting worse in academia because of the corporatization of universities. But I think that what I encourage my students to do, for better or for worse, is to really go deep and figure out what your purpose is for doing this degree in education, and then seek out what's your theory of change, and seek out affiliated faculty across this amazing university and amazing city, as well as come down and visit us at Penn. Hey, let me poach our students. There's an ethnography forum in the spring. But I think that maybe doing more of this to create more communities across the different schools, Stanford and Berkeley as well. But Julie's, doing urban studies. So Michael Katz is on her committee. She's doing their certificate. And a lot of our students are working with John Jackson and Deb Thomas in anthropology, and John's also in communications. Maybe there's something about Penn that facilitates those kinds of, makes it less political, which is usually about money or egos. But there's a lot of really good people on this campus, and I don't know what the requirements are, and you've got a lot of great people in your program too, but develop relationships outside, and some of our students get jobs in ed schools, some of our students get jobs in global studies programs, in childhood studies programs, urban studies programs, Asian American studies the ed studies programs that are smaller at universities. Small liberal arts colleges often look for people who have kind of more foundations orientation to education, because they can teach courses in urban studies as well as in education. So don't lose heart and follow your heart.
I want to
Good luck.
add to that. You talked about politics, and there's a lot there to unpack, but you also addressed this sense of anxiety. And I remember that very clearly. I was very fortunate to have two phenomenal advisors. Both women have been invoked today, Dorothy Holland and Catherine Lutz. And they teased me mercilessly. Dottie told me at one point, "You're the only student I've ever had who was simultaneously preparing for 5 different careers." But I was, because if I had gone home to the Appalachian Mountains and told my grandfather, who spent his career in a factory making blankets, that I just spent 8 years pursuing a doctorate, but I was unemployed, that wasn't going to, they were already doubting my capacity to reason that I was spending that long in the university, right? So I was very strategic about the kinds of things I was trying to prepare for, and I think that's part of what we have to do too. There are a lot of different kinds of jobs in and out of the academy that we can pursue. So it's think about your goal and your purpose and your theory of change. It's network. It's all of these things, but it's also strategy, which is not to say that it's all on the student, right? It's not. No. Our institutions owe that to our students, and we need to do a better job of that.
Help me out, anybody who remembers better, because my memory of that article. It's an article by Lois Weiss and Michelle Fine in the AEQ, so look it up to get their word on it. But they were drawing attention to the ways that in ethnographic work in education we can try to simultaneously have our focus on the issues of class in particular. They were, multiple identities, but specifically class issues, social class issues. and at the same time be thinking about the roles of culture in learning and teaching. So, you know, in a prior issue, it was his Council on Anthropology and Education presidential, or not, his Spindler Award address, where he talked about that he'd sort of reviewed the past 10 years of anthropological educational research, and some things that he was pleased to see was that there was more attention being paid to social class. And so I'm not going to say any more because I'm afraid I'll, you know, botch up what they're saying. But that's the idea, is to have not just explain it. In some ways, I guess it harks back to the Erickson-Ogbu debate that Kathy Hall referred to not just explain things one way or another, but try to have multiple critical lenses on what we're seeing. Does that help?
So couple, just to weave together two of these last questions that I thought were really important. And so the question right here about the current direction of educational reform in the United States, which is a really crucial question, and it's something that we ought to have something to say about, right? And but anthropologists, I agree with you, have not grappled with this very intentionally. And you know, one of the things that I've seen recently, as I was getting ready to do this work with the Principals Academy in Minnesota, is one of the required readings is Mark Tucker's book, Surpassing Shanghai. Okay, and if you haven't read this, it's worth taking a look at, and there's a video on it too. And parts of it are, yeah, right. So parts of it are quite disturbing. And especially his contention that the United States has embarked on a school reform course that is really completely untested and is completely different than other nations that have demonstrably improved their school systems for all students, right? And that's really quite a thing to say. And I do think that's a correct reading of the case, but it is alarming that anthropologists have not weighed in on this. And I think that this goes back to the comment on multi-sited ethnography, because I think this is perhaps something that we could contribute. And for me, I'm thinking about the vision of anthropology articulated by Laura Nader. And she wrote a great piece years ago, and it's easy to remember. The title of this is just Anthropology, exclamation point. Look for it. And in this piece, she says, for anthropologists, we make connections that aren't made elsewhere. Who else is going to put it all together? And so in the case of school reform, for example, those connections perhaps are points of a multi-sited ethnography. So for example, what do high school athletics have to do with America's, the lassitude with which we approach meaningful school reform?
So I'll just comment, I think, gathering a few of the different comments, questions that were raised. Starting first with this one about multi-sidedness and in our own ethnographic projects and how problems are defined. I want to try to do this briefly because I know we're just about out of time. Recent work that I've been doing in South Africa with, which I've written up and characterized as ethnographic monitoring, partly because I've been struggling with how I, as an ethnographer, can consider what I'm doing ethnographic in these cases, in two cases, in Limpopo province and also in KwaZulu-Natal province, in both cases being invited by individuals in higher education institutions to come and be with them for 2 or 3 weeks to help them thinking through their initiatives to implement indigenous African languages as languages of instruction in their institutions. So that's the sort of the broad scenario. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that, the reason I think this is partly an answer to your question and also a comment on Fred's comments about interpreting and prophecy. I think that and also the question back there about how to work with communities in situations of language and culture transformation. I think my role in these two institutions has been primarily as an interpreter, along the lines of what I was saying in response to the question back there, who supports local prophets. So in other words, these are folks, I've been working with people who are the prophets in their local situations. I have huge admiration for these people, and I develop even huger admiration in the time I spend with them and have a chance to get to know them. And using my ethnographer's skills to record what I see and hear and what they tell me and give it back to them. And that's one way that I'm working in a multi-sided way at a scale that's, I mean, it's in this case the whole higher ed institution, and within it certain initiatives, and within it certain individuals. So there's some scalability there, I guess, I don't know. But the problems are being defined from their end. I'm not the one that, I mean, I have the larger issue of how multilingual language policy gets implemented in particular contexts, but the specific problems that are being worked out there are emerging from the local participants. It's one way of doing it.
Wow, I don't know. These questions have been fabulous, and thank you. I guess I'm drawn to comment on, as much as I can, the insecurity and marginalization that many of you are graduate students, I think. I think that what I started laying out in terms of all the different ways of being an anthropologist and studying education, and the different ways people can be situated, the different ways they can define the problem, the different groups of scholars they can work with, the different purposes, makes this a cacophony of voices sometimes, but it's also a very exciting place to be. And I think it allows for these kinds of conversations, and I think that our communities are increasingly diverse, not diverse enough. So there's also increasing kinds of affiliations that can be made for those of you who are students of color and feel marginalized doubly as educational scholars, and students who haven't been present historically in the conversations in this great a number. So I think that I'm excited to see what all of you will do, because I think there's a lot of our students are doing filmic work now with John Jackson, and we haven't even talked about the multimodalities of research. And you're living in a time when the research project, not only in terms of some of the innovative work in anthropology and geography about multiscalar, multi-sided ethnography and materiality and all of that, which I think speaks to my argument about theoretical innovations and keeping current in relation to what your particular issues are, and the innovative ways that what that kind of theory brings into relief about the role of materiality and what can be answered by looking at those kinds of things in those kinds of ways. But also the modes of doing research, the ways you're going to produce your research are all changing. So it's a very frightening, insecure, uncertain, precarious, immensely promising moment. So, I'm the first person in my family only person in my family to graduate from college, and I've kind of felt marginal all along. I've never been racialized, but I think it's a really powerful place to either connect with other prophets or to become a prophet as much as you can, not fewer as eloquent as Fred is in that sense, but hold on to your truths and find communities that can support you in that. And I look forward to seeing where it all takes all of you and getting to know some of you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you all very much.